April the 25th, 1915, men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed at Gallipoli. It was on that day the traditions of our fighting forces were born. These stories of their sons and daughters at war we proudly dedicate to the memory of Anzac.
February 1942. The greatest British fortress in the Far East prepares to surrender to the might of Japan. This captured Japanese film shows how the doomed city appeared to the invaders as they moved in to occupy it. Yet within 3 years, this army, which conquered more space in a 6 months campaign than any other in history, will be mopped up and destroyed. This is the story of one of those mopping up operations, the story of Bougainville. In 1942, the Japanese captured Rabaul, destined to become the enemy's main forward base in the Pacific. To protect this base, the enemy then seized the Solomons. They landed on Bougainville and Guadalcanal. The Japanese war machine was precise and deadly as it closed in on its prey. On March the 8th, 1942, 8 Japanese warships and their aircraft escort reached Bougainville. The Australian garrison of 50 Army and Air Force men and a score of civilian coast watchers was overwhelmed. The enemy had seized another island group and added it to the great arc of island defenses guarding its newly conquered empire. Methodically, the enemy net closed over defenseless Bougainville. This was easy work, a bicycle war, but it was war all the same, war in deadly earnest. This was the face of conquest. This was the time of triumph. Triumph did not last. Within weeks, Australia, though desperately short of aircraft, hit back at the invader. These Royal Australian Air Force raids were but a taste of what was to follow as Allied power in the Pacific accumulated. As Japan moved into the southern Solomons, Australian airmen sought out his hidden troop concentrations and raided his supply dumps. Having turned the Japanese back in the Coral Sea battle, now planned their first offensive in the Southwest Pacific. United States Marines assaulted Guadalcanal and seized the vital airstrip Henderson Field. Despite counterattacks, they held it. With Guadalcanal finally secured, the next move was north to Bougainville. Again, United States Marines provided the assault troops. The target, Torquay in Empress Augusta Bay. November 1943, and once again Bougainville is being invaded, but this time it's defended with 40,000 crack Japanese troops. The Americans, veterans now in amphibious warfare after 2 years of bitter island fighting, concentrate their attack in one paralyzing blow at Torquay. naval bombardment, the assault troops raced to the beach and strike inland to establish a perimeter. The beachhead was quickly secured. The enemy counterattacked fiercely, but in vain. Reinforcements poured ashore, and within weeks the Allies had established a strong perimeter. For a year, Americans and Japanese shared this 90-mile-long volcanic island. Then in October 1944, Australian troops moved in and relieved the Americans. These Australian soldiers, men of the 3rd Division and the 11th and 23rd Brigades, were militia. But they brought to this assignment experience of hard jungle fighting at Milne Bay and from Wau to Salamoa, battles in which they had fought and held their own alongside the 6th and 7th Divisions of the AIF. Now, led by AIF veterans, these militia units of 2 Corps were undertaking a major operation of their own for the first time. They were to succeed brilliantly. The infantry battalions moved ashore to take over the perimeter. Their supplies were moved in after them. Supplies were precious, as shipping was scarce. It might be many weeks before another convoy could be spared for Bougainville. Nor could reinforcements be spared. Every fighting man in General Sturdy's First Army was committed to battle in mopping-up operations against nearly 100,000 Japanese on a 900-mile front extending from Wewak in Dutch New Guinea to Bougainville. The Australians, moving in with orders to destroy the enemy, would have to fight under severe handicaps. The campaign was planned as a 3-pronged drive along the Numa Numa Trail, south to Buin via Status Knoll, and north to the Sarakin Peninsula. This was the Numa Numa Trail, a native pad snaking some 35 miles from Torokina over a 10,000-foot mountain spine to the west coast. With the support of New Zealand and Australian aircraft, the 9th Battalion broke out of the perimeter and moved up the trail to cut the enemy force into isolated halves at either end of the island. If you wish to see your next of kin, don't forget your Atterbury. The Numa Numa Trail was the Kokoda Trail of Bougainville. Rain-soaked, fever-ridden, the yellow anti-malarial Atterbury pills had to be taken every day. The men snatched a rest when they could. In this treacherous country, rest was a rarity. This was total war, waged by handfuls of men, living, fighting and dying less than 100 yards from each other in murderous scuffles with an unseen enemy. Royal Australian and New Zealand Air Force pilots played a vital role. Once again, the men of the sister dominions of the Pacific were in action together. They made an unbeatable team. This New Zealand Corsair is headed for the first big obstacle of the Numa Numa Trail, Artillery Hill, a strongly fortified ridge held by the Japanese. Australian casualties were light, but the wounded faced an agonizing journey back to Torquay. These Solomon Islanders proved as staunch as the fuzzy-wuzzy angels of the Kokoda Trail. Artillery Hill fell to one company of the Australian 9th Battalion. At Torquay, the 2nd 1st Australian General Hospital began to receive casualties as the attack developed. Here, men and women of the Royal Australian Medical Corps, doctors, nurses, orderlies, and the girls of the Army Women's Medical Service, the AMWAs, established a first-class modern hospital. These were the heroines of the Australian Army, tireless, selfless, indomitable, conquering exhaustion in a country where white women had never had to work before. Division southern thrust along the coastal strip gathered force. They advanced through fever-laden swamps. By January, the 7th Brigade, men of Milne Bay fame, had pushed through the swamps and across rivers to positions halfway between Torquay and the main Japanese base at Bougainville. Then the 25th Battalion, supported by an airdrop supply service, was ferried down the coast and landed behind the enemy forward positions. Without air supply, they would be lost. But day after day, in all kinds of weather, the supplies reached them. Even copies of Guinea Gold, the Army newspaper. Tanks pushed through to link up with this isolated striking force. The surprise assault carried the Puriata River and drove forward towards the Bougainville Road. At Slater's Knoll, where the 25th Battalion had dug in, the Japanese cut their line communications and attacked savagely. Signalmen, guarded against ambush, made repairs. The counterattacks were repulsed. The enemy's losses, 10 times ours, were crippling. He retreated, leaving his wounded to be cared for by the Australians. This wounded digger shows a mate just where the bullet went, clean through his tobacco, adding insult to injury. The enemy counterattacks were suicidal, but unavailing. Behind Slater's Knoll, the engineers, helped by natives, hacked a road through the jungle to get supplies forward for the next big thrust towards Bougainville. The pace of this assault was determined by the speed with which the engineers could bridge rivers to get transport forward. Worked the clock round, defying exhaustion, conquering an unyielding wilderness. Aircraft of 36th Squadron and Number 10 Air Supply Unit of the RAAF expanded their dropping operations as fresh battalions of the 3rd Division moved forward to relieve the 7th Brigade. By April, 2 brigades were in action, and the supply problem became doubly difficult. Brigadier Tack Hammer's 15th Brigade, veterans of Salamoa, opened the next stage of the attack. Casualties mounted. A 4-mile advance cost 120 Australian lives. The troops pressed forward behind tanks of 7 and 9 troops of B Squadron of the 2nd 4th Armoured Regiment. Back Back at the Australian base, other men in uniform helped to make the Bougainville campaign completely self-supporting. It takes all sorts of soldiers to win a war, and the Bakers, who kept the 3rd Division supplied, made a very real contribution to victory. Meanwhile, Air Force reconnaissance planes probed to the north of the island. Beneath them, the Australian 3rd Prong fought its way against Japanese Marines, through swamps, over ridges, and from one plantation to another. The Australians pressed on until they could overlook Buka Passage. In this fighting, Private Frank Partridge of the 8th Battalion became the youngest Australian of World War II to win the Victoria Cross. The Japanese still had coastal barges and could strike where least expected. The Air Force task was to strike first. Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers of the RNZAF pounded the northern air bases and blasted enemy shipping. On the ground, the 3rd prong of the attack pinned an enemy force in the narrow Sarakan Peninsula. From there, Australian heavy artillery began to bombard the Japanese anti-aircraft defenses on Buka Island, 9 miles across the strait. Accurate fire silenced the enemy guns. The Bougainville fighting ended only with the Japanese surrender after Hiroshima. Then cards like this, safe conduct passes promising good treatment, were issued in bundles to the Air Force to distribute over the areas where still powerful parties of the enemy garrison were known to be hiding. Leaflet bombers carried Japanese signs painted under their wings to indicate that their mission was peaceful. On August the 18th, a Japanese surrender delegation crossed the Levo River to report to officers of 3 Division headquarters. HMAS Lithgow carried them to 2 Corps headquarters. The Air Force, junior member of the armed forces, was not absent from this historic scene. Now, the mopping up operation was over. Operation Roundup was beginning, but on both sides, suspicion was still high. On August the 20th, the enemy commander in the Solomons, Lieutenant General Kander, and his staff boarded Lithgow for an appointment with Lieutenant General Savage, commanding the Australian 2nd Corps. What did the men of Lithgow feel at this climax of their war? Elation? Relief? Curiosity? And what were the thoughts of their enemies? Only they can tell. No chances were taken. This had been a treacherous war. Who knew when treachery ended? Each of the party had to submit to search, and the search was thorough. Now the stage is set for the last scene of all, the meeting of the senior commanders on each side and the formal surrender. General Kander hands over his sword to General Savage, and with it surrenders 23,500 Japanese soldiers, sailors and airmen, the survivors of a force which had once numbered nearly 40,000 men. The The surrender terms are stated and accepted. The surrender instrument is signed. The Bougainville campaign is over. But the roundup is far from finished. Brigadier Stevenson's 11th Brigade has the task of reoccupying Kahali, south of Bougainville. It's another beach landing for the men of Baroki and Simba Ridge, but this time a peaceful one. While the Australian garrison disembarks, lugging its gear ashore, 2 of their officers advance to receive the enemy surrender. Courtesies exchanged, both sides relax as the first practical details of the takeover are discussed. Formality returns as the Japanese are taken into custody. Now they are prisoners of war. The Australians begin to establish their camp while parties of soldiers escort the enemy units to the assembly point. Australia formally takes possession of Kahali, and a special parade is held to honor the gallant Australians who have laid down their lives in this campaign. At places all over Bougainville, scenes like this are taking place. Some suspicious, some sullen, all solemn. In place after place, the terms are formally stated, the details are read out and interpreted, the document is signed. Swords, dozens of them, are surrendered. Still they come, and still the swords accumulate, until shifting the swords, let alone the prisoners, becomes heavy work. Work that can be passed fittingly to the prisoners of war themselves. Before long, the Aussie souvenir sense asserts itself. Japanese prisoners are put to work, under the terms of the Geneva Convention, to construct an airstrip which is needed for the Oster aircraft flying in supplies. This pilot flies back for fresh supplies. The isolated Australians below have settled in as much comfort as possible. Enemy officers help with the paperwork of repatriation. Some prisoners, handed their prisoner of war tags, seem to have grave doubts whether they should accept them. And so, at last, the Japanese, who came superbly in an armada guarded by fighters, are herded out of the islands they conquered and shipped ignominiously back to their own devastated country. The arms they're forced to leave behind are destroyed. Never again will these tanks parade contemptuously through captured cities and towns. Finally, 2 Corps hands over to the civil administration after a last parade by the stalwart Solomon Islands native platoons. General Savage inspects them for the last time, watched by their countrymen. One man, whose devotion and courage were outstanding, receives the decoration with which Australia symbolically acknowledges its debt to a loyal, steadfast people. Finally, General Savage takes the salute of his own men, the militia units of 2 Corps, among them Private Frank Partridge, B.C. General Savage said later, "These were young men who often could not obtain their parents' consent to join the AIF. But at Milne Bay, Salamoa, Alexis Haven and Bougainville, they fought as bravely as the men of Bardia and Tobruk, as the men of Gallipoli and Flanders. Proudly, they had upheld the fighting tradition of Anzac."